work for the economy, for the environment, for social objectives, and then linking that to the question of how do we align circular economy policies with trade policies, and how can we find out what role trade can play in this session. If we can start my presentation. Perfect. Thank you. So basically, the objectives are really to connect the insights from work on circular economy with work on trade and discuss the role of trade in the circular economy transition. And we've identified 3 questions that we would love to discuss about. Not necessarily answer all of them completely. I don't think that that's possible, but at least we can try to see whether we can find common ground to make progress on these. So how can the circular economy transition be designed to have triple dividends for economy, labor markets, and the environment? How can trade contribute to a more resource efficient and circular economy? And in what ways can we secure policy coherence to facilitate the circular economy? And that's policy coherence between trade and environmental policy. So the agenda is that we start off with a series of presentations on relevant OECD work on the circular economy that we've been carrying out for the last 5-6 years. First on the economic and environmental dimensions of the circular economy transition, then on the role of trade in the circular economy transition. And then the third part is on promoting markets for reusing and recycling lithium-ion batteries. First part of the first presentation I will do immediately after my introduction. Then I will hand over to my colleague Shunta Yamaguchi, who is a trade and environment policy analyst. I think more or less your title at the OECD Environment Directorate. And then for talking about the circular economy and the lithium-ion batteries, we have our colleague Evdokia Moise, who is joining us online for her presentation. After that, I am glad to hand over to the person next to me, Olivia Cook, who is one of the WTO TESD co-facilitators on the trade and circular economy working groups of the mission of Chile to the WTO. I think you all know her very well if you've ever been here, because she's like always, whenever you follow these types of circular economy discussions at the WTO, her name keeps coming up and her face keeps coming up. So we're very happy that she's here and that she has time to then guide us through a panel discussion with 2 additional panelists. First, we have Hugo Challis. He's advisor for international negotiations at the European Commission. He's also joining us online. Hugo actually has a long tradition of working on circular economy issues in the European Commission. And the second panelist that we have here in the room is Christophe Bellman, the head of policy analysis and strategy at Forum for Trade, Environment and the SDGs, in short, TESS. So with that, I think I might immediately jump into the first presentation. If this works. I keep clicking, but this doesn't seem to. Here we go. So first, as a kind of a framing, every time I talk about circular economy with people, and then at the OECD, for example, everybody in the European Commission is perfectly fine talking about the circular economy. The moment you go beyond Europe, there's always this hesitation about what is then this circular economy. Is there one circular economy? Are there multiple circular economies? Circular economy is a means, not an end. In Japan, they have a completely different terminology for these. And in the US, they tend to focus more on resource efficiency and sustainable materials management. So basically what we do is we say, well, this circular economy is just a shortcut for a much broader set of issues. It's about closing resource loops, which you could say is the narrow version of a circular economy, but it's also about slowing resource loops, having more durable design, eco-design, increased reuse, repair, and remanufacture. it is part of a broader circular economy. And finally, there's also narrowing the resource flows. In other words, improving resource efficiency. So the full title would then be the transition towards a more resource efficient and circular economy. And if we all just agree that when we say circular economy, we mean that, then I think we don't need the lengthy titles anymore in the rest of this discussion. But I just wanted to have that up front. When we say circular economy, we actually mean the broader issue. So we've done quite a bit of analysis on circular economy work, focusing on quantitative analysis, doing basically modeling for how does materials use evolve over the coming decades and how is that linked to economic activity, what kind of environmental pressures are related to that. And we'll focus on that in a moment. The second part is on policy analysis, trying to find out how do we scale up circular business models, how do we deal with digitalization as a vehicle to improve circular economy. We've also done some work on plastics, which is part of a circular economy transition, but we will not focus much on that today. And finally, we've done a number of papers on aligning international trade and the transition to a circular economy. So first of all, if we look at the scale of the problem, it's this open door. It's going to get worse before it's going to get better. And clearly, it's going to get worse if we don't change policies. Global materials use will more than double by 2060, with a significant increase in non-metallic minerals, sand, gravel, those types of materials being dredged up from riverbeds and being dredged up from oceans. And used a lot in construction. So if we want to have an economic development that has high growth through infrastructure development, for example, infrastructure development means construction. Construction means materials used for construction. And so there's a lot of pressure in economic development to have an increase in the use of materials. The other three parts, metals, fossil fuels, biomass, are all also intended to expected to increase if we don't change policies. So a doubling of materials use doesn't mean that nothing is happening. We have current policies already. We have all kinds of mechanisms in terms of productivity increases, etc. over time. So basically, we can split this into saying, well, there's a pressure for more materials use just to fuel economic growth. Economic activity needs materials. And as long as these are not secondary materials, but primary materials, because there is no circular economy policy, then that would lead to a more than tripling of materials use. But we also have, over the coming decades, something that we tend to call the servitization of the economy. There is a more and more use of services in industry. There is more demand for services by households. So services sectors grow faster than industrial sectors, not in all countries, but especially in OECD countries, that is the case. And at the global level, that's also the case, that basically there is a transition away from the more primary sectors towards services sectors. And that means a lower growth for materials use. Then the third part is on technological change. We basically every year learn to do things better. We learn to figure out how to use less materials and make the same output. And that also diminishes materials use. I think I'm lost again, shouldn't I? Sorry. Sorry for this disruption. Maybe you should just click. So the growth in materials differs widely across materials, and we have 60 materials in our analysis, and they're all growing, but they're definitely not growing at the same speed. I think we move on from that. Go on. And it's also that the materials use is increasing in all countries. It's increasing in OECD countries. It's increasing in emerging economies. It's increasing probably faster in developing countries, but that's from a much lower base. And therefore, a higher growth doesn't mean that you get materials use levels in these countries that is higher. Yeah, thanks. So with an increase in materials use, we get a growing environmental impact. Materials use is associated with greenhouse gas emissions from extraction, processing. There's all kinds of environmental impacts related to that. And these tend to increase quite rapidly. Sorry. And basically the environmental impacts are wide ranged. We have local problems related to extraction, but these are not the same in every country. I mean, Chile is a prime example of a country that really tries to do extraction of materials in an environmentally sound manner and with reducing the environmental impacts as much as possible. And it's something that other countries can learn from. Other countries have high copper and nickel environmental impacts from copper and nickel. And the problem is that not all these materials have the same environmental footprint. Sand and gravel has a relatively low environmental footprint, although it does have problems, cause problems in rivers, for example, and it does cause other problems. And we have, for example, building regulations that don't allow us to use secondary materials in buildings. So what happens if we tear down buildings in almost all the countries, it's used as road filler. So this is downgrading materials from a prime use into a much lower value use. So what we really need is to make this switch towards secondary materials and make sure that we preserve the value of materials as they enter the environment. So we have done some analysis of what that then means. And very briefly, we've been looking at a fiscal policy only. It's a very narrow set of policies, but just to give you an impression is that we find that that there's a big difference between materials use reductions between countries and then the macroeconomic impacts. And a fiscal policy on its own has a tendency to lower, to have negative macroeconomic impacts, but it does, if you have a fiscal policy, it does generate revenues that you can use, for example, to boost labor markets. So what we find is that in principle, there's a small macroeconomic cost, especially in non-OECD countries, if you want to have a global transition to a circular economy, but there's an employment gain in almost all countries. And I don't have the time to go into the details, but we have the reports to then say about it. So talking about gains in labor markets, because I think that that's one of the core benefits that we can have from a transition to a circular economy is that we boost jobs. And then you could look at it from the aspect of how many brown jobs are there or how many green jobs are there. And then you count them up and then you say, well, these are basically balancing each other out. We now no longer need coal miners, but we need people working in recycling sectors. And if you can, those maybe cancel each other out almost. And there's not a big jobs gain to be get from that. But what does happen in the circular economy transition is that you get a job gain also in other clean sectors in the economy, basically in services sectors. So we get in primary materials, job loss, and then in minerals and in construction, we might also get some job loss, but that's compensated by job gains in secondary metals, and especially in services sectors. So it's the message that we often have is look for the job gains, not very closely in these narrow clean sectors and these narrow circular sectors, but look for the job gains in the rest of your economy as you make this transition and you're boosting economic growth. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague Shunta for the second part of our presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Rob, for handing over. And I'd like to dive in immediately on some of the trade aspects of the circular economy. But before I do so, I'd like to start a little bit about some of the work that we've done from this Recircle project, which is on resource efficiency and circular economy, which cover different areas. And starting from the left top-hand side, we have done a lot of work on extended producer responsibility schemes and updated guidance on impact of online sales. Also more recent work on modulated fees. And then we've also looked at government support for primary and secondary materials, where we see that support for primary seems to be much more than secondary at the moment. We've also done some work with the nexus between circular economy and labeling programs, digital technologies, business models, and finally trade. But today, I don't have enough time to go through all of them, and I'll focus on this part, but you can access these reports through the link in the very bottom, and these slides will be made available by the organizers after this event. Now, turning to the linkages with circular economy and trade here, I'd like to show a schematic. Here we have a linear economy where we produce, consume, and dispose products when they reach end of life. And the circular economy aims to close material loops such as recycling, higher value loops such as refurbishment, manufacturing, reuse, and repair. There could be efforts upstream such as eco-design, product service systems, or the sharing economy. And a lot of this happens within national boundaries, but there are important linkages with international trade in three main ways. The first is through global supply chains. The second is through end-of-life value chains, such as trade in secondhand goods, goods for refurbishment manufacturing, trade in waste for recovery, and trade in secondary raw materials. And the third pillar is the role of trade in services, as the circular economy transition has high service sector involvement, as Rob just alluded to. Now, there are several pressure points to look at. So first is how the circular economy transition has an impact on trade patterns. The second is around how to secure policy coherence. Third is understanding the nature of trade in waste, secondary materials, secondhand goods. And finally, understanding the role of international cooperation. So starting with this very first point on how circular economy transition has an impact on trade, as Rob mentioned, we've done a lot of modeling analysis on this, and we tried to have a sort of make projections if we would have a global circular economy transition based on physical tax reforms. And here are some results by 2040 with the blue bars on outputs and the gray bars on exports. And there are two stories to tell here. So starting from the very left-hand side, we have aluminum, where global outputs will be reduced by over 10%, but exports will be improved by over 10%. And this tells a story that production bases and exports bases will become more specialized. On the very right-hand side, on recycling sectors, these sectors will grow by over 50%. And both of these things tell a story that trade has an important role to play in the transition towards a resource-efficient and circular economy. If I unpack this using another diagram, this is also work by Rob, by the way, is unpacking this through scale effect, efficiency effect, and the trade effect. And here we see that reducing material really requires substitution, efficiency, and finally the role of trade shown in the light blue bars below. Now then, the story goes on, how do we try to secure policy coherence between trade and also circular economy policies? And first we looked at multilateral trading systems. Here, these are very much the ones that you are familiar with, such as non-discrimination, general exceptions, technical barriers to trade, transparency, consultation, and capacity building. And so far, what we find is that there seems to be ample space in the multilateral trading system that allows circular economy policies to strive, where we've only found a few disputes that were based on discriminatory practices. Now, also, we have emerging dialogue under the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structure discussions and the informal working group on trade and circular economy that started from this year, which is also dealt by our colleague here, Olivia. Now, turning to a more regional setting, there seems to be more sort of ahead of the curve initiatives going on. And so far, circular economy provisions are found in at least 2 agreements and 5 drafts. And the first one, the UK-New Zealand FTA, which has been signed, includes an specific article covering several aspects, such as eco-design, information sharing, labeling, and quality standards. And then there are other mentioning of circular economy provisions in these other agreements. And below, there are also other agreements that do not have circular economy provisions per se, but there are related provisions such as references to natural resources and waste management, the Basel Convention, food waste. There are also a lot of provisions around manufactured goods, such as clarifying the status or limiting the use of import restrictions. There are also recycling services commitments found in several FTAs. And finally, there's also a bilateral dialogue on raw materials under the CETA agreement between EU and Canada. Now, turning to circular economy policies, there might be a question, what are they actually? So at the OECD, we did a survey back in 2017 to have a better understanding. The left-hand panel are those that are implemented. The right-hand panels are those that are either planned or under consideration. We basically see that this can be chunked into maybe 6 categories. First is around extended producer responsibility and product stewardship schemes. The second around taxes and subsidies. Third around eco-design. Fourth on green government procurement. Fifth on eco-labeling. And finally, around different standards. And I think these are the ones that would have some implications to trade. So how do we go forward with these 2 policy areas and issues for consideration? These are my 2 final slides. So starting from the top, trade can contribute to a circular economy by help achieving economies of scale. And therefore, trade barriers or trade impediments for circular business models needs to be addressed. But at the same time, environmental dumping or trade leading to any negative environmental consequences need to be avoided, and how to strike the right balance is really at the heart of this issue. Turning to supply chains, the circular economy concept should extend to them, and especially ensuring this environmental, sustainable, just transition for the extractive sector. This is very important. Now, circular economy opportunities for end-of-life value chains could be mixed. There could be some promising opportunities for trade in secondary raw materials or trade in goods for refurbishment and manufacturing, where the end use is fairly clear. There could be other challenging areas with potential trade-offs, just between environmental protection and economic efficiency, such as trade in waste and scrap and secondhand goods, which we need more work in this area. Trade in services also appear critical, and this typically requires the free movement of people, information, and data, such as for repairing activities, monitoring activities, and managing end-of-life recuperation, and so on. And finally, we need better transparency and traceability for a trade to work for the circular economy, which brings me to my final slide. So towards a mutually supportive trade and circular economy agenda, there's several things that we could possibly consider. The first is promoting trade in environmental goods and services, such as those related to recycling and waste management, or secondary raw materials and goods for refurbishment and manufacturing. The second point on definitions and classifications, this is a complicated story, as there are different differences in definitions and classifications of waste, secondary materials, secondhand goods, and goods for refurbishment and manufacturing, and those between relationships also with the harmonized system codes. So possible alignment or more clarification of this is very important. Standards, circular economy related standards are emerging, such as recyclability, repairability, material content, material quality, and therefore the harmonization and mutual acceptance of these related standards or conformity assessment procedures will become extremely important. Also, cooperation towards developing common standards are also seen to be very important, such as those on secondary raw materials. On regulations, first on extended producer responsibility schemes, these really need to think about how they account for end-of-life value chains and to tackle free riding from online sales. Also to support cross-border reverse supply chains, which was a focus area of yesterday's discussion. Securing prior informed consent procedures is absolutely necessary. Also clarifying the status of the traded good is also an important one. Tackling illegal waste trade and removing trade restrictions where possible is also an important dimension. And finally, the further areas of cooperation can include those on aid for trade, trade facilitation, digital technology and innovation, also upstream efforts such as on eco-design or consideration of product passports. So this is a lot of information, but I'll hand it over back to Rob for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shunta. I think we can immediately go on to the third presentation by our colleague Evdokia.
Thank you, Rob. Let me try and share my screen. Okay. Does it work?
Yes, we see your slides, but not as a presentation. It's not in as a slideshow.
Okay.
So we see the notes.
Okay. So let me. And now?
Still the same.
I don't know what else to do. You know,
it's quite clearly to read right now. So maybe you can just proceed like this.
Okay, we'll do that. We'll do that. Okay, so following colleagues' presentations on you know, the circular economy and policy considerations, I would like to focus on a case study, which I think will illustrate some of the points that they have been made. It's a case study on lithium-ion batteries, and more specifically, lithium-ion batteries used to power electric vehicles, not handheld devices. And it's a study that has been prepared by myself and my colleague or ex-colleague Stella Rubinova. Stella has been with us at the OECD and is currently moved to the Economic Research Division there in the WTO Secretariat. Okay, do you have the next slide?
No, unfortunately, we still see slide 1.
Would it be easier if, because you know you must have it yourselves, if I can't move, what about now?
We see slide 1. Sorry.
Okay. Would it be possible to have it moved on your end?
We're looking at it right now. I think Shunta is putting it up right now. So if you all bear, maybe.
Okay.
Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
Then Shunta can share his screen and we
Perfect.
can hear you, but unfortunately not see you, I guess.
Okay. So, you know, I was talking about lithium-ion batteries. They power modern economies. They are in our phones and in our laptops. And more recently, they have become essential in the efforts to decarbonize our economies by powering electric vehicles and also by being used to balance energy supply from renewable energy sources, such as solar energy. Next slide, please. the use of lithium-ion batteries in electric vehicles has caused an exponential increase in lithium-ion battery production. What you see now on the screen is actual figures, how the production of lithium-ion batteries has evolved from 2008 to 2021. And then if you can move to see the next part of the slide, these are projections from, you have in the right-hand side of the slide, 2019, 20, and 21, and the rest is projections, and we are looking at a very considerable increase in the production of lithium-ion batteries. So with this increase in the production, yes, thank you, Shunta, we will have quite increased requirements in the supply of certain raw materials. For instance, lithium, nickel, and cobalt are materials that account for around 40% of the current cost of batteries in electric vehicles. So if we have 100% for the battery itself, the lithium-ion part is 30%, and the materials that are used to build it account for 12% of the whole vehicle cost. And being reliant on those virgin materials in the production of the batteries exposes the whole electric vehicle value chain to disruptions and price volatility. For instance, 79% of global cobalt supply was produced in countries with a restriction on cobalt exports in 2022, and this share is also high for global manganese and global nickel production, respectively 64% and 59%. Next slide, please. So beyond this issue of increasing requirements for certain raw materials and the potential for disruptions and price volatility, we have another issue, which is an environmental problem, the health and environmental hazard from dumping waste lithium-ion batteries. So currently, most of lithium-ion battery waste comes from personal devices and very little from electric vehicles. We are not yet in a maturity of that supply chain. And so the recycling of those batteries is a nascent industry. Many of them end up in landfills, which is not a sustainable solution from all points of view, both from the point of view of material sourcing, from the point of view of health and environmental hazard. And this problem will only grow as the sales of lithium-ion batteries increase. So recycling those batteries can help reduce excessive dependence on virgin materials. If you can just, thank you, Shunta. And risks associated with price volatility and security of supply. It further offers the opportunity to reduce the environmental costs associated not only with landfilling, but with mining of such materials, as well as the amount of raw materials that would have to be extracted and produced to meet the projected increasing demand. Market projections suggest that secondary material from battery recycling could meet at least 28% of new battery material demand by 2040. Emissions associated with electric car production could decrease by 14 to 23% by 2040 if their crucial component, the lithium-ion batteries, are recycled and the resulting secondary raw materials used in new battery production. Next slide, please. So this scheme shows you the what the circular chain for those batteries looks for. We have the collection, transportation, sorting, and discharging the batteries, which usually happens either locally or regionally. Then these are pre-processed to produce what we call black mass. It's a recuperation of the materials that are contained in the battery in a mixture, which can then be much more easily transported and moved into recovery facilities to allow for material recovery. And that often happens much closer to the sites of production of new battery grade materials. The batteries themselves are highly flammable, so transportation and storage require adequate conditions, and hence this tendency of doing the first steps locally or at the maximum regionally. But there are also other possibilities that can be envisaged, such as the direct reuse of those batteries for applications that demand less, lower energy performance, and then they can be given a second life through stationary energy storage that can extend their life for several years. There are several issues that can come up here. The one is that obviously the longer the second life of those batteries is extended, the further away the recuperation of materials to avoid new mining new materials in the production of new batteries. At the same time, in the recycling of the batteries, the sorting is tricky because of the multiplicity of designs and chemistries. So not everyone can do that. And while we see, for instance, that for conventional lead acid batteries, we have quite a movement and quite a lot of recycling happening in all parts of the world, including in developing countries. This is less easy for those batteries. Discharge and dismantling requires skilled personnel or advanced robotic lines, and the material recovery is capital intensive. Next slide, please. The current situation with recycling capacity, we have a very important concentration. 73% of that recycling capacity is currently concentrated in China, where most of the black mass after the dismantling of the batteries moves, and very little, 27% happening in other parts of the world. Shunta, can you please click again? So end-of-life lithium-ion batteries from Europe and North America are shipped to the Southeast Asia for pre-processing. And then the processed waste is shipped to material recovery installations that are located close to material producers, like in China and South Korea. The plans announced by recycling companies suggest that scale is necessary, especially when it comes to the material recovery of the process. But we expect that some regionalization of battery recycling will happen as more capacity is created in Europe and North America. Next slide, please. In order for this expansion to take place, there are a couple of factors that come in play. One of them is innovation. And you see here in the slide on your left-hand side, the breakdown of patents by recycling stage. So how many you have for material recovery, for repair, for pre-processing, or for reuse. And then on the right-hand side, the patents by applicant type, business sector, research institutions, and individuals. There were around 40 worldwide patent applications filed each year between 2017 and 2020 linked to lithium-ion battery recycling. Japan, the United States, China, and South Korea dominate the innovation space, followed by Germany, Canada, Belgium, and France. Globally, most patent applications are filed by established producers of batteries and of lithium-ion battery materials, such as Umicore, GX Nippon Mining and Metals, Sumitomo Metal Mining. And then recycling companies are driving innovation, especially in North America. And the business sector accounts overall for most lithium-ion battery recycling innovation, but research institutions also play an important role, especially in China, France, and the United States. And as seen in the graph, in most countries, innovation primarily focuses on the most profitable stage of battery recycling, which is material recovery and production. Next slide, please. However, apologies. The second factor that plays, in addition to innovation, is new investments to expand the lithium-ion battery recycling capacity. And we see those happening, in particular in Europe and North America. In 2021, several major existing players expanded their foreign direct investment in those regions. South Korean SanYil, for instance, more than doubled its investment from 2019 in Hungary. Canadian LI Cycle further invested into recycling capacity in the United States, and Singaporean TES which already operates a recycling plant in France, expanded its investment in Europe by establishing recycling capacity in the Netherlands. As a result of these investments, global recycling capacity will become much less concentrated by 2025, with China's share predicted to drop to around 50%. Next slide, please. However, even with all that innovation activity and investment activity, international trade will continue to be important for the circular economy of electric vehicle batteries. In the period between 2017 and 2020, almost 300,000 used electric vehicles were exported from the United States, and the recipient countries span the world. Even as more battery recycling capacity is developed in the US and in the European Union, many electric vehicle batteries will reach the end of life in third countries and may need to be exported again in order to be recycled. So to give some preliminary conclusions, from that study in the next slide. The development of the recycling market for lithium-ion batteries is central to the low-carbon transition, but the recycling market is in its infancy. With the exception of China, it has not yet reached the scale necessary for widespread commercial application. And right now, international trade plays a very important role to move those batteries to where the recycling capacity is located, that is essentially in Southeast Asia. And while the global recycling capacity is expected to become more evenly distributed in the future, many lithium-ion batteries will come to the end of life in developing countries. And so international, and given the technical and capital requirements for properly recycling and reusing them, international trade will continue to be central to closing the loop for lithium-ion batteries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evdokia. Now there will be a chance for the audience, people online, people here in the room, to ask questions, raise their own discussion points, but I think we should start now with the panel. We're already halfway through the session, so I want to hand over to Olivia to take us through that part.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. So let's move straight to the panel segment of this event. As Rob already mentioned, Hugo and Christoph will be joining Rob, Shulta, and Evdokia. I just want to complement what Rob said regarding the opening for questions. We will do it in a little while, but in the meantime, for those connected online, you can start putting your questions in the chat box, if that is okay. So we have just heard three presentations. So let's go straight to some initial remarks by Hugo and Christoph. If it's okay, Hugo, you're connected online. Maybe we can start with you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Olivia, and it's a pleasure to be with you, at least virtually. And just to say that I'm very much encouraged by the type of discussions and the type of events that happen in and around WTO these days, because I go back a very long time in working with GATT and WTO and trade and environment, and I see that there is a very different mindset these days in dealing with issues that link trade policy and important developments in the area of sustainable development and environment these days. From a very defensive approach, the trade policy community has shifted to a very positive, proactive, and engaged approach. And I think the discussion we're having today on the relationship between circular economy and trade is a very good indicator of that. I think that the different presentations that I've heard now very clearly point out that while the issue of a transition to, and I think in the European Union we like to say a transition to a circular economy faces, is something that can be done to a certain degree at the national, at the regional level. But in order to harness the full potential of that transition, both in the terms of gains with regard to economic growth, prosperity, and welfare on the one hand, and on the other hand, the diminishing the environmental impact of economic activities on the other hand, can only be gotten through measures and activities that apply to globally integrated value chains. And I think that this is something that we are faced with in the majority of economic activities. And I think that some of the cases that we've heard today clearly exemplify that we need to look at a positive interaction between rules that may be established and policy initiatives that may be established at the national and domestic level on the one hand, and the sort of the necessary international enabling regulatory environment that will support that. And I think that environment is in a way comprised of several aspects of it. On the one hand, there is the global community that sets environmental rules, that actually tries to define environmental and sustainability objectives in that sense. But on the other hand, we need to look at how trade policy can play its role in facilitating the attainment of that rules and at the same time maximizing the potential welfare gains for everybody. And I think that when you look at the discussion that I've heard from the three speakers, there is obviously a very clear role in trying to identify how can the implementation of circular economy approaches at the global level be facilitated. What are the tools that we can look at with regard to a trade policy and related disciplines in that regard? What role, for instance, can harmonizing technical standards, sustainability criteria, what role can labeling and information requirements play? What role can the interlinkage between trade policy and the World Customs Organization, thinking about the issue of, are the system of harmonized customs code actually conducive right now to provide the necessary transparency that helps to facilitate the transition to circular economy approaches also globally? I think there are a number of positive challenges in that regard. And I think that the different discussions that I'm following in the context of the work on trade and environment are very encouraging, because they really look at the positive synergies and the positive reinforcing action that can be taken in the different policy areas, be it in multilateral environmental policy, be it in the capacity building and structural support policy by international organizations, and of course by to see what role and what supportive tools can be gained from trade policy in that regard. So I'll stop here for my first statement. Thank you.
Thank you, especially for bringing that part of the interplay of different levels of regulation into the discussion and the role of trade into that. So with that, we go straight to Christoph.
Thank you, Olivia. And first of all, congratulations to the OECD for the wealth of research and analysis that has been undertaken in this area. It's really impressive, and I think the OECD has really been at the forefront of many of the work and the analysis in this area. We had three very different presentations, and so I will not go into the details of all the presentations. Maybe let me just highlight three key points or key challenges that we need to keep in mind when we look at this interface between trade and circular economy. Many of these have been highlighted in the presentations, but I think it's important to reinforce them. The first is when we look at trade and circular economy, there is a natural tendency to focus on the end of life stage or of the production, be it trade in remanufactured goods, trade in waste, because this is where a lot of trade is happening, and this is also where a lot of prospects and benefits may lie. That said, one has to keep in mind that this end of life has to be put in the broader context, or is part of a broader strategy that should really focus at all the different stages of the life cycle. And it's about, yes, recycling, yes, safe disposal, yes, reusing, but let's think also about the reducing the use of raw material as one of the key aspects, redesigning waste out of the value chain, substituting some of the goods. If you take the example of plastics, for example, we know that plastic recycling is absolutely essential, but we also know that if we want to eliminate plastic pollution, a big part of the agenda will have to be about reducing just the production and substituting and redesigning a lot of the things. So I think that's one first point. The second challenge is this risk, and I think this was mentioned also yesterday in some panels about this circular economy gap, particularly the risk that if circular economy solutions imply very high and sophisticated technologies, there is clearly a risk that some countries might be marginalized in this process and maybe left behind. And that would, of course, be highly problematic from a broader development perspective. Think of, for example, if a circular economy transition in textiles ends up in basically reshoring most of the production in developed countries which have the access to the kind of necessary technology, this may be at the expense of a lot of job losses in a number of developing countries. And I think that when we look at the impact on jobs, as was done by Rob, I think it's also important maybe to look at how this might play internationally, and how, at the end of the day, how do we make sure that this transition also generates some development benefits and development gains? How can producers of cobalt, lithium actually use this to move up the value chains and generate value addition and make sure that this contributes to their development strategy? The third element, again, when we talk about trade in the circular economy, is to strike this balance, and I think Shunta mentioned it a number of times, is really to strike the right balance between economic and trade interests and the environmental dimensions, keeping in mind that trade is not an end in itself in this area. It has to serve the bigger purpose of an environmental benefits. Yes, there are many difficulties and complications for trading waste, particularly hazardous waste, but of course restrictions there are there for a purpose, and we want to make sure that facilitating trade in this area is not done at the expense of the environmental objectives. So I think these are really some of the key kind of challenges that we keep facing in these discussions, but again, thanks and congratulations again to the OECD for a very in-depth and great research in all these areas.
Thank you, Christophe. And now that we have heard from the 5 initial panelists, first, I want to thank every one of you for those remarks. This is what always happens to me in circular economy, that we get so much information and from such different perspectives. So we have heard a dimension from the labor market. We have heard the connection to trade. We have heard case study very particular on batteries. Then we have heard about regulations and the interplay of different levels of regulations. And we have heard the development dimension. Before I'm already seeing requests for the floor, but before we go there, I want to do a round of questions with the panelists. There will be 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll go to the floor. The first one, I want to pick up on the connection on trade policy and circular economy and the issue of development. And the issue of international cooperation. So I'm thinking that this may be, I'm looking at Rob, at Christophe, at Hugo online. The first one is, can circular economy and trade policies be better aligned to take advantage of synergies and ensure that circular economy transitions generate benefits in all pillars of sustainable development? And then how can developing countries be integrated into this circular economy transitions and in a global circular economy transition? Do you see a role for multilateral dialogue in facilitating this transition? What are the opportunities, the challenges, and that could emerge towards this transition? And what would be the role for trade in that? I know there are a lot of elements here, so don't feel obliged to address each one of them. But if I could get reactions from Rob first, then Christoph, and then Hugo, please.
Thank you. Excellent question. I think Hugo said it very nicely in his opening statement. The circular economy can be done locally, regionally, but the real gains and the real benefits come globally. And I think we have to realize that the international cooperation to achieve this circular economy transition is vital. We need to scale up secondary markets. We need to scale up the demand for secondary markets. We need to also scale up the supply of secondary markets. So we need trade to bring together trade, demand and supply. We need trade to scale up business models. We've seen a lot of circular economy business models that work very nicely on a local level, but at a local level, they don't contribute enough to make a large-scale transition. And if we want to scale those up to something more than local, we need to scale up these business models in a way that, for example, there is enough scrap to be used in secondary production, that we have enough. So on the one hand, we need to try to liberalize trade as much as possible, if it is done sustainable, if it is about things that we know can be reused, manufactured, etc., and will be dealt with properly in the destination. If we can scale up all these trade flows so that we have better business models for recycling, better business models for remanufacturing, etc., better business models also for handling the hazardous parts of commodities. But we have to balance that at the same time with ensuring that whatever trade takes place, as Christoph says, the regulations are there for a reason. So it has to be balanced with doing it in such a way that we avoid dumping of waste. We're currently working on illegal trade and environmental crime. And basically, it's an area where we have no data. We have some ideas, but it's really something that comes here to mind as well, as it is hard. But one of the steps we need to do, for example, is better classifications of trade flows, better understanding what is traded, for what purpose, where to, etc. The other element, I know I'm taking a long time, I'm sorry for that. The other element I just wanted to briefly bring in is I've had quite a lot of discussions about waste management in Africa. And people I talked to in South Africa, for example, in South Africa, they're very happy and open to improve waste management and have international financing, for example, for improving waste management. In other African countries, it's often still more problematic and for good reasons. But it is one of the low-hanging fruits. Improving waste management is one of the low-hanging fruits for making the circular economy transition work. So we have to find ways in which we can make that happen. This is about capacity building. This might be about development assistance and other international financing. This might be about technology transfer. There's lots of things we can think of how to achieve this. But it's much better to prevent these environmental problems than to clean them up. And cleaning up is always the most expensive part. And if we don't have better waste management systems, we will have to clean up eventually.
Thank you. So we go now to Hugo.
Thank you. I mean, many questions, and if we try to address all of them, I think we'd be here for a long time. It would be very interesting, but I don't think the panel is here for that. You asked what, on the one hand, how could that be facilitated and would be the main areas of cooperation and support to make sure that also countries at all stages of economic and social development can profit. I think that the issue of the correct alignment of cooperation activities with circularity objectives is important. And I think I want to come back to something that was said earlier. A lot of emphasis is on end of waste stage of the product cycle. A lot of emphasis on the end of life technologies. But I think that we actually need to look at what would be the activities that benefit different countries at different stages at the best. And I want to take a case example of my own, referring particularly to plastics. The main problem with regards to circularity are created at the stage of design of products and materials. It's at that stage that it is decided whether something is durable or non-durable, reusable or single use, easy to dismantle and therefore easy to recycle or not. So I think that the road to a cost-effective approach goes through intervention at the right stage of the product cycle. And that means that when you look at where you want to put your money, is it in very comprehensive and sometimes complex and sometimes costly waste management systems, or do you want to try and clean up the product cycle in that regard at source? And that's one of the elements that one could put into the play. The second is what is supportive in terms of international regulation and the role of different policies. And then it's like empowering countries to make the right policy decisions that suit their national and domestic needs. And that may be, in some instances, information that allows them to make the choice of which plastics, to keep with that example, they want on their market and which plastics they don't want on their market, depending on the challenge that specific products or their consumption mode poses for their governance and waste management systems. So in a sense, I go back to the second issue, which is transparency, provision of information about material and chemical composition of certain things that can play in that regard, which I think can make the intervention at national and domestic level targeted and cost effective, because you know what you will get and what you can deal with. So I think that's sort of, on the one hand, to reflect on your question about what are the intervention points, what would be the focus of cooperation on the one hand. On the other hand, what would be the issue of the role of different regimes in facilitating that this moves smoothly, and also to allow countries at different stages of development to benefit from the transition to a circular economy, because they may have different requirements, and we need to enable that they can actually live up and choose according to their requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph.
Thank you. Yes, no, I would agree with the notion that many of the trade-related circular economy policies can perfectly be actually implemented unilaterally, but having cooperation will really enhance their effectiveness, both in, I would say, promoting the type of trade that we need to promote, but also to reducing or eliminating the kind of trade that is problematic, starting with illegal trade and in other areas. So cooperation, yes, absolutely needed at all levels. It is good for the environment. I think it would really enhance the environmental impact. It is good for the private sector. It will reduce the differences in regulations across different jurisdictions. It will be good from a development perspective as well. It will make sure that policies are not designed in complete isolation. Now, what should be the areas of cooperation? We have, I think that has been mentioned, is the TESDI initiative in the WTO, but also the plastic initiative provide really two very interesting venues to start a discussion on the trade-related aspects of the circular economy. My own sense is that if we want this discussion to be really useful and move forward, it would have to be very much apply to specific sectors and specific value chains. When you look at the lithium ion batteries, you have a complete different picture than when you're looking at e-waste or looking at plastics or textiles for that matter. So some sort of I think of a sector-specific approach would be useful. And then I think one of the key areas where cooperation can play a good role is to make sure that trade-related policies are designed in a way that takes into account the concerns of other countries. And maybe an area which we've said in the past could be explored in the context of these different initiatives is how to develop kind of good practices, best practices, or guidelines for the design of trade-related circular economy policies to make sure that they really minimize not only the impact for exporters, but also really maximize their environmental benefits.
Thank you. And let me bring in Evdokia and Shunta with maybe two specific questions because the whole of life cycle approach has been mentioned. So Evdokia, I wanted to first ask, or maybe you can start with this, on the issue or the specific case of batteries. Is there a need, or do you think there's a need for specific international trade discussions on batteries management that includes both upstream and downstream dimensions? Are there any efforts in place, and how would trade policy come into that? And then on the issue of waste, and here I am looking at you, are regulations on trade of the end-of-life products affecting circular economy transitions, either negatively or positively? And is there something to be addressed here? Can trade be liberalized among countries with good waste management practices without increasing risks of waste, of mishandling of waste and leakages? I think it's already been brought up in several of the interventions, but from a trade perspective. So maybe we can start with Shunta, and then we can go to Evdokia, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivia, for raising the question. And before I dive directly into the role of waste trade, maybe I'd like to reflect also a bit on the first question about the role of international cooperation and sort of the development angle here. And here, I think it's important to have a step back, thinking about why do we want to strive towards a circular economy? Why are we thinking about this? And as Rob highlighted in his presentation, we know that the circular economy transition can help us achieve the triple dividend of economic growth, environmental protection, and also job creation. So I think this is in the interest of many economies. It also helps achieve the SDGs on sustainable consumption and production, and also help achieving the Paris Agreement as well. So I think the starting basis is that there's a common interest that many countries signed up to as a commitment, and this will help strive going forward. And the question with the trade element is how do we find the right balance or trying to have better clarity on the trade that we want to help support the circular economy transition and those that we do not. Now, turning to this question on waste trade, this is an extremely complicated one, extremely challenging, and a lot of international discussions are still ongoing in this area. And some of the complexities relates to that waste trade tends to flow from countries that have high environmental policy stringency to those that are fairly low. And also a lot of these destinations, recipients, have issues around illegal waste trade and the involvement of the informal sector. So there are various dimensions to look at. But at the same time, there's two sides to the coin where, as I said before, there's trade that we do not want, like hazardous waste trade, as well as the trade that we do want, such as trade in secondary raw materials. So And the world right now is fairly focused on trying to increase control, such as the amendments on the Basel Conventions on plastics and also the new amendments on e-waste. And perhaps there's less attention on the fractions where what we can facilitate. And in this regard, I think the prior informed consent procedures under the Basel Convention or the OECD decision on the transboundary movement of waste could play a fairly important role. However, when we talk to the industry, they say that it takes quite a long time to get a green light on these notifications. So securing the swift implementation of this is quite important. And also, as raised earlier by other panelists, tackling illegal waste trade is also very important to stop these flows, as well as to facilitate legitimate flows as well. So I'll stop here and hand the floor back to Olivia.
Thank you. And let's go straight to Evdokia online.
Thank you, Olivia. Specific discussions on batteries, I would say no. For batteries, for the circular chains of batteries, life cycle requirements are as important as in other supply chains. The relative weight of different parts of the chain may be different, and in the case of lithium-ion batteries, as I have tried to show, there is quite an important component of, on the one hand, safety of those operations, so not to put in every hand, not possible to put in every hand, and on the other hand, of security of supply of materials and trying to close material loops. There has been, over the last months, with the disruptions that we have been experiencing, a very significant concern in various parts of the world of better securing the supply of critical materials, be it for the green transition or for other industrial processes. And in the case of batteries, it would be an important aspect. However, despite this concern, or maybe in favor of this concern, looking at the batteries chain in a life cycle way will allow to have a much sounder approach, both from an economic and from an environmental point of view. Electric vehicles may be producing zero emissions while they move, but in order to be constructed, this is far from being a net zero emission proposition. And so we need to bring down the footprint of their production by acting both at the level of closing those materials loops and of extending the chain. The policy measures that can be taken in that direction are manifold, and it will be, I think, a big challenge of striking the right balance between command and control regulations that might be stifling future innovation. And again, we have tried to show that innovation in the field, in recycling those batteries, but also in finding alternatives for some of the materials that are in the batteries, looking for different chemistries that might be eventually environmentally more friendly. And so bringing the whole life cycle of the electric vehicles in a much more environmentally friendly shape. Very strong command and control regulations may be problematic from that point of view. So I would, at the end of the day, go back to what Shunta was saying about facilitating regulations, of controlling what we don't want moving around, hazardous materials, and at the same time allowing what we want to be moving around in order to obtain the economies of scale and the scale, the capacity scale we need by encouraging harmonization of design standards, introducing, facilitating provisions at the border to make sure that things are moved smoothly, if securely. That's probably the best approach for trade policy at this stage.
Thank you very much. And we will go to the room. We had a request for the floor. I will ask if you can please introduce yourself, and then if you can direct the questions to somebody on the panel, that'd be great.
Alev Mine of the One Goal Initiative. Couple of things. Our dependence on the dependence of our upholding the flow in the circular economy there is a dependence on the continued use of certain products in certain relative proportions to each other, because if we're going to recycle something into something else, then we count on it that the other use will be continued also, so that we can actually have a place to place the output. Now we must think about, for resilience, we must think about alternatives in that sense, and this would also require, having the information about what can, which are the alternatives, which are the options that we could have, and to have that information constantly available to everybody so that they can actually put their things through. So it takes a lot of data and sort of a platform. There's a need for a platform like that. And then I've noted that the producers of the batteries are also the ones bringing about the patents for the recycling of the batteries. This gives them an incentive to reduce the duration of the life of the product, which means that we need to have a mechanism to put a lid on the speed of the circulation in the circular economy when there's an issue like that. Yeah, thank you. Well, to whomever, yes.
Thank you. Some very good points on the information data, on slowing down, and on the incentives on regulations. We're going to, I think, take 2 or 3 questions and then just turn back to the panel and see who reacts to what. I have, yes?
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. My name's Luca Marmo. I work in the Director General for Environment of the European Commission at the European Union. I have a question, not to Hugo, but to Shunta, and then a reflection following up on Eudokia's last intervention. The question to Shunta, is about your presentation. You mentioned resource tax or material tax, and you had a slide with impacts that would have. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what exactly were part of your analysis? I mean, what kind of tax, how would be shaped, and what kind of contribution could give? I think it's a particularly interesting, idea. I guess fairly problematic from a political viewpoint, but so interested in your views on that. Also, because I was in parallel to this meeting, there is a meeting of the International Resource Panel, and funnily enough, this same idea was floated also in that context. So interested to have the OECD analysis on that point. The comment about Eudokia's, I think it's clear that there is no thing such a free lunch. So electrification is certainly going to help for certain aspects, but there is the resource implications, and you have mentioned very important aspects in your presentation. I think possibly from a viewpoint of global sustainability, just having the same number or even increasing number of cars instead of combustion engine moving to an electric engine will not necessarily bring us forward in terms of sustainability. For all the reasons in terms of material resource needs, geopolitical aspects linked with that, aspects related to the recycling that you highlighted, and environmental impacts. So we need to be careful in what we do, that we don't create by trying to solving today's problem a bigger problem for tomorrow. Thank you.
And thank you. We had one question on the chat that was how can the private sector share their experiences and come into these debates? So with these 3 questions and comments, I'm very aware of the time. I'm just going to give the floor back to each one of the panelists for the final answers, reflections, comments in the time that we don't really have. And we'll do it in inverse order from which we started. So Christoph, you can kick off.
Well, thank you. I think these were mostly comments on and questions for Shunta and Evdokia. So in the interest of time.
I think we're going to have to condense. So no final comments? No. Hugo, any final comments or reactions?
Well, no final comments in the sense of saving time. Just a comment on the issue of information. I think if I understood the question correctly, it was a little bit about the challenge of how to actually manage and how to deal with the information flows and the availability of information that may be necessary for directing the streams of products and materials. I think that new technologies that we have made that a lot easier. And in that context, I think in Europe, we're looking at the development of what we call a digital product passport, which is not a passport that accompanies a product, but which is information that can be put at the disposal of the actor in the value chain electronically. And I think that may be a tool that would help internationalize certain things and facilitate that certain things are being done. I think that's all I would say, reflecting on the question that's been asked. And with that, thank you very much for having invited me. And I think it was a very interesting afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Evdokia?
Well, I can't resist to first react to Luca's reaction. I totally agree with you. I mean, it's not because we're talking about the circular chains for batteries or for electric vehicles that with that we have solved all the problems. The sustainability efforts are multi-pronged and need to be pursued as such. Having said that, obviously we won't be able well, in our generation or even that of our children, do away with all of it. So being able to find, let's say, less bad solutions is still important. And going, you know, to the question that was initially raised from the floor about, if I may call them that, perverse incentives. I would say, on the contrary, that if the producers are introducing patents, it is in their research of solutions to a number of economical problems they are facing. And by that, I mean the availability of materials, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the requirements from regulatory authorities to move towards certain solutions that are less taxing on the environment. So I don't see the creation of patents as a counter incentive for that would push to shorten that value chain, but on the contrary, as an indication that a number of regulations that have been put in place and of economic, let's say, constraints are taken seriously by the private sector, and it is probably the role of authorities to further encourage in that direction. Thank you.
Please.
Yes, very briefly. So first, the question from the lady from the floor. I think this issue about intellectual property rights has been raised a number of times, such as IPR and the right to repair. I don't think there's an immediate answer to this yet, but what we do want to ensure that we don't want planned obsolescence to happen at the design stage. So how to phase that out is probably the most important question, and there are upstream efforts along the way. The question from Luca about the subsidies. So if I understand your question correctly, we've looked into some of the policies that are already in place, such as landfill taxes or taxes on virgin materials, and also subsidies on the recycling sectors, and combining that and using it into our modeling analysis. But perhaps Rob can further reflect on that, and we can follow up bilaterally. And finally, this engagement with the private sector, which was raised in the chat, is extremely important in my view. We have several initiatives through the WTO right now. There are also initiatives at the World Customs Organization to better engage with the private sector, and us as well at the OECD. So we hope that we could better engage to really understand the trade impediments that you are facing. And that's all from my side.
From me, because this is the last of me, thank you very much for the opportunity. Very interesting to hearing all of you. I thank you to the interpreters. I'm so sorry for the time management. So Rob, your word is the final word.
And so much to say in so little time. On the private sector, I think, yes, we do have, in our research, we try to always find communications with both extractive sectors and recycling sectors. So basically both parts of industry and private sector that's important. We have a memorandum of understanding with the International Chamber of Commerce, for example, that has, I think, 4 key areas, and one of them is circular economy. So this is definitely something that both policymakers and private sectors know that they need to engage with each other on that. On the materials taxes, etc. In the interest of time, Luca, I'll follow up with you bilaterally. That saves me a very complicated answer. Let me wrap up what some of my key takeaways from this discussion from today. And I've noted 4 things that I picked up. You might have heard different things, and that's fine. First of all, we need an all of life cycle approach. Both the problems and the solutions start upstream, and we can solve things downstream, but we need to focus not only on the downstream. Second thing that I've picked up is, I think Shunta phrased it more or less directly as, we need to facilitate the good flows and regulate the bad flows. Christoph also said almost literally the same. So if they agree, I think I'm not going to argue. So that's something that I picked up. Third thing that I picked up is development and cooperation. These angles are crucial, as only the global transition brings us real economic and environmental gains. And that makes it, we just did a study last year that was about the triple dividend for environmental, social, and economic benefits from environmental policy. So now we have a quadruple challenge, and with bringing the development angle in there. But it is essential that we have a global approach and that we have a global perspective on where the bottlenecks are and how to resolve them. And the fourth one, it's a little bit implicit in a lot of these discussions, but I think Ugo was the one that said it most clearly, and that is that TESD and IDP, these new initiatives at the WTO, are crucial developments. We're very happy to see that there is movement. This is really a step forward. This means that there is discussion at the WTO, and it's been too long, maybe too late, but no, not too late, but it is urgent. But it is happening, and that thrills us all, I think. So with that, I want to thank all the panelists for their participation. Olivia, for your excellent moderation of the panel. It was hard with so little time. And all the audience for listening and your questions. And with that, I wish you a good evening.